It all began on a crisp Saturday morning, the kind where you wake up feeling like the world is full of possibilities. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee mug in hand, ready to savor a peaceful moment before starting the day's chores. But instead of the tranquil scene I anticipated, I found myself staring at an empty spot where my prized tomatoes had been just yesterday. I stood there, frozen, the steam from my coffee swirling in the morning light as I gaped at the barren space in disbelief. It felt like a parent discovering their child's bed empty in the middle of the night. Dramatic, I know, but these weren't just tomatoes. They were my pride, my joy, and frankly, my only escape from the daily grind. Gardening was cheaper than therapy, and those tomatoes represented hours of care, sweat, and sunburns. Losing them wasn't just inconvenient, it was personal. As I stood on the porch mourning their disappearance, I cast a weary eye around the neighborhood. The peaceful suburb I called home suddenly felt a little less friendly. Perfectly trimmed lawns, pastel-colored shutters, and neighbors with practiced smiles now seemed to hide dark secrets. Someone had trespassed onto my property and stolen my tomatoes, and I was determined to find out who. I took a deep breath, reminding myself this wasn't some high-stakes detective thriller yet. Maybe it was a fluke, a hungry squirrel with gourmet taste, or a raccoon expanding its palate. That idea, oddly enough, was more comforting than the alternative, a neighbor with nefarious intentions. I shook off the paranoia and went back inside, determined not to overthink things. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, the thief had been thorough. Not a trace of tomato was left behind, no half-eaten fruit, no paw prints, just the sad, leafy remnants of what had once been my garden's crowning achievement. Frustration boiled over. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to get away with it again. I was done playing the passive victim. It was time to turn amateur sleuth. Armed with my smartphone camera and a newly purchased wireless security system, I transformed from part-time gardener into full-time detective. And soon, I had a prime suspect, Beatrice. Yes, that Beatrice, the infamous president of our homeowners association. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her fastidious lawn inspections, her passive-aggressive emails about trash can placement, and her commitment to enforcing rules no one else even knew existed. Beatrice had always taken an unusual interest in my garden, particularly my tomatoes. On more than one occasion, she had criticized my relaxed gardening style, once suggesting I use symmetrical cages to maintain community standards. She disliked my casual approach to yard work, and I took great pleasure in ignoring her unsolicited advice. Still, I never imagined she would stoop to tomato thievery. But now I wasn't so sure. I decided to casually observe her. It didn't take long before something suspicious happened. That very evening, while I was watering the remaining plants and trying to look innocent, Beatrice strolled past my yard with her miniature schnauzer, Max. She slowed as she approached, her eyes narrowing at my sad, stubby tomato plants. Then, catching me watching her, she flashed a bright, artificial smile and waved dramatically. "What a shame about your tomatoes," she said, her tone sugary with a sharp edge. "Gardening isn't for everyone." I returned her smile with the same forced cheer, mumbling something about pesky raccoons. But in my heart, I suspected the pest was wearing sensible shoes and a pastel cardigan. After Beatrice passed, I wasted no time setting up my surveillance. I concealed the camera in the leaves, adjusted the angle, and checked the feed on my phone. Perfect. If Beatrice, or anyone else, came back for more, I'd catch them in the act. The next morning, I woke before dawn and immediately checked the footage. At first, everything seemed normal, birds chirping, leaves rustling. But then, there she was, Beatrice, wearing what I could only describe as stealth mode gardening gear, oversized straw hat, gardening gloves, and pink Crocs, casually walked up to my plants like she was shopping at the farmer's market. My jaw dropped as I watched her pluck a ripe tomato, tuck it into a tote bag, and glance around like she was pulling off an international jewel heist. I sat back in shock, emotions swirling between disbelief, rage, and uncontrollable laughter. Beatrice wasn't just enforcing arbitrary HOA rules. She was pilfering my produce. The nerve. The audacity. Part of me imagined her throwing a neighborhood tomato salad party, claiming it was all organic and locally sourced, without mentioning her supplier. But amusement quickly turned to resolve. This wasn't just petty theft anymore. Beatrice had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let it slide. If she wanted tomatoes so badly, I decided I'd give her something she wouldn't forget. Inspiration struck while I was scrolling through my phone and stumbled across a video titled Carolina Reaper Pepper Challenge. Watching grown adults cry, sweat, and gasp for breath after biting into the world's hottest pepper filled me with diabolical glee. I had a new plan. I would plant Carolina Reapers, disguised among my tomatoes. The next time Beatrice tried to swipe one of my precious fruits, she'd get a mouthful of pure, unrelenting fire. The very next day, I went to the gardening store and picked out the healthiest Carolina Reaper seedlings they had. The cashier gave me a strange look as I explained, a little too cheerfully, that I planned to plant them next to my tomatoes. I could only imagine what he was thinking, but I didn't care. Soon, my trap would be set. Back home, I planted the Reapers with care, tucking them in among the tomato plants. As I watered them, I silently apologized for their dangerous mission ahead, yet I couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. These peppers were no ordinary produce. They were my secret weapons. As the days passed, I nurtured my Carolina Reapers like prized pets. They grew bright and angry red, tiny grenades waiting to explode. Even watering them felt risky, like one wrong move could unleash their fury prematurely. It wasn't long before my neighbors started noticing my renewed dedication to gardening. Larry, who lived next door, peered over the fence one afternoon and chuckled. "Going for Gardener of the Year, are you?" he teased. I laughed nervously, careful not to reveal my true motives. Larry didn't need to know about my pepper sabotage. Not yet. Then, just as my Reapers ripened to perfection, Beatrice came snooping again. She appeared without warning, Max in tow, just as I finished camouflaging the peppers with carefully placed tomato leaves. "Interesting choice of fertilizer," she remarked, peering over the fence with a skeptical look. Even Max seemed to regard me with suspicion. "Just experimenting," I replied casually, heart racing. Beatrice stepped closer, her expression turning serious. "Remember," she said, holding up a finger as if delivering ancient wisdom, "community guidelines require all plants to be non-hazardous and aesthetically pleasing. Wouldn't want anyone to get poisoned, would we?" Her words hung in the air like a threat. I forced a laugh. "Of course not, Beatrice." She narrowed her eyes, clearly not convinced, but eventually turned away. The moment she left, I exhaled in relief. It was time to accelerate my plan. That night, I monitored my security feed obsessively. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, finally, my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I grabbed it with sweaty palms. The grainy footage showed a figure slipping through the gate, but it wasn't Beatrice. It was a teenager from down the street. He plucked one of the Reapers, took a bite, and immediately regretted it. I watched him flail and sprint toward the hose, desperately trying to cool the inferno in his mouth. I felt a pang of guilt, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing the peppers do their job. Unfortunately, this wasn't the thief I'd been waiting for. And then, a twist. Beatrice returned. This time, she wasn't subtle. She accused me of violating HOA rules, overcrowded plants, disorderly layout, you name it. Her usual tactics. But I saw an opportunity. If Beatrice couldn't resist controlling things, maybe I could lure her into my garden by deliberately making it messy. So, I rearranged my plants to be just chaotic enough to tempt her into meddling. And it worked. One humid evening, Beatrice snuck into my garden once again, dressed absurdly in her stealth gear. She scanned the plants and, seeing a particularly plump pepper disguised among the tomatoes, plucked it. My breath caught in my throat as she took a confident bite. The result was immediate. Her eyes widened in shock as the fire hit. She dropped the pepper, clutched her mouth, and stumbled blindly for the hose. In her panic, she managed to spray herself in the face. Max barked furiously as his owner flailed and shrieked. I couldn't stop laughing. Beatrice bolted from my yard, screeching about poisoned tomatoes. She ran straight into Mr. Henderson, who was out for his evening stroll. She grabbed his newspaper and waved it wildly as if it could extinguish the flames in her mouth. Mr. Henderson stood frozen in confusion. Later that night, I replayed the footage over and over. It was comedy gold, but I knew Beatrice wouldn't take this lying down. Sure enough, the next day, I received a formal email from the HOA, accusing me of maintaining hazardous plants and demanding immediate action. Beatrice was escalating the battle. At the HOA hearing, Beatrice arrived dramatically, wearing sunglasses indoors, her voice trembling as she recounted her traumatic experience. She claimed the peppers were weapons designed to harm. But I had my evidence, clear footage of her stealing my produce. And then, unexpectedly, Susan, the quiet HOA secretary, stood up. She testified that she'd seen Beatrice trespassing and stealing from my garden weeks before. The tide turned. Beatrice's supporters faltered. The board promised to review the evidence. The meeting ended in tense silence. Afterward, something surprising happened. Gardening fever swept the neighborhood. People planted tomatoes, peppers, herbs, turning their yards into vegetable sanctuaries. Even Larry built a greenhouse. The Harrisons, an elderly couple, became tomato farmers. It was like a suburban gardening revolution. And Beatrice? She retaliated with petty complaints. Too many leaves, too big a plant. But her power was fading. I realized I needed a final move. At the local farmers market, I learned about a hybrid pepper, crossbreeding ghost peppers with Carolina Reapers to create something hotter than both. I couldn't resist. With Larry's help, I grew these peppers in secret. By the next HOA meeting, my hybrid peppers were legend. I brought them in, offering Beatrice a taste test. She took the bait. Her reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Red-faced, sweating, she bolted from the room. The HOA board dismissed all her complaints. The neighborhood cheered. That night, I sat in my garden, at peace for the first time in months. The war was over. Gardening had brought us together and taken down tyranny. And as I bit into a tomato, savoring its sweetness, I smiled, knowing justice had never tasted so good.